Hello, I'm Marcia Cavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, a federal case alleging sex trafficking by a high-profile city worker raised questions about the volume of such activity locally. In another action, this one a federal lawsuit, the company involved with providing actors for Entergy's public hearing is accused of extortion in a European case. We'll look at these stories, as well as a federal court ruling on a Louisiana abortion law, a follow-up to the clergy controversy, an auction item linked to Lincoln, and Disney cruises into town. On board for us are tonight's Informed Sources. Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources. Kevin McGill, reporter, The Associated Press. Michael Isaac Stein, reporter, The Lens. And Ramon Antonio Vargas, reporter, The New Orleans Advocate. We're going to go over to Ramon first. And you did a story this week about a bill of information filed on a city worker whose last name happens to be Kellogg. He is the oldest son of the retired Supreme Court Justice Pascal Kellogg, and this is Pascal Kellogg III. And this is involving a sex trafficking charge. It's another disturbing story, and so fill us in on this.
Yeah, Pascal Kellogg III, who worked in the City of New Orleans' Information Technology Department for quite a long time. I think he was a 25-year employee, if my math is correct. And he was essentially charged of I'm trying to think of trafficking, plotting to traffic a 14-year-old girl for other men to have sex, and the Bill of Information alleges that he had sex with the girl as well. That seems like it would fit the definition of the state charge of felony carnal knowledge of a juvenile, which is what is colloquially referred to as statutory rape, but he is not directly charged with that allegation. He's just charged with conspiring to help traffic the girl. And
once again, this is going to go through federal court. Yes. And so, when there is a bill of information, what does that indicate?
He is. It's a strong indicator that he is whenever. A bill of information is a strong indicator that a defendant is negotiating a plea deal, or it does not intend to contest the charge at a trial. You often see that when obviously the federal government offers that to somebody that has indicated that they are willing to cooperate to kind of go to turn over someone that's higher than them, and especially in a conspiracy case.
So the time frame for this, when this allegedly happened, when was this? Last year, was it? Or
last
this year?
It was last year, over a month, I believe, beginning in May of 2017, and he's also accused of lending his home to a man who had sex with a girl, and he's accused of also, I think, using text messages to kind of advertise the opportunity, if you will, and I think it certainly that fits the pattern, I think, of how often you see these cases. A lot of the time, using text messages, electronic, social media applications. There's a state case. That involved a video of the victim in that case being trafficked and essentially sexually abused on a live stream that ended up turning the authorities' attention onto it. So there's certainly some elements that you kind of start seeing as you read these documents, similarities between cases.
What do you hear? Is there much activity out there?
You see these cases they're not difficult to find, unfortunately, when you're going through, state court records or federal court records. At the same time, there's no indication the case, while there are similarities between the two cases that I'm discussing, you've got one defendant who's 59 years old, which would be Pascal Kellogg III, and then in the other case, you've got a defendant in his 20s, I believe 26, and no indication that they run in the same circles. So I think it's certainly not any kind of there's no one if you point at this person and you eliminate this person, then that activity goes away. I mean, I think it's pretty fractured and disorganized, but you do see it.
So you make a point now, about the ease of electronic devices. I mean, is this really sort of changing this trade here, this human trafficking? Is it increasing it, maybe making it easier?
I think I don't know if there's any indication, at least in my reporting, that's actually what's happening. I mean, certainly text messages and social media. I mean, it's certainly not necessarily new technology. You often, at the same time, I think, resorting to that has made the job of authorities. It certainly helps authorities do their job as far as trying to disrupt that.
Because it could leave, an electronic trail, as it were, like the text messages and pictures, et cetera, that are alleged to have been sent in this case. So any response yet from either Calogero or his lawyer? Or
no, his attorney is Billy Gibbons, who is obviously a very high-profile defense attorney. And just the combination of it being a bill of information and the involvement of an attorney like Billy Gibbons seems to indicate that that this will result in a plea, and whether whether that then leads to other people accused in this plot, I guess we'll have to wait and see. But it certainly is heading in that direction.
Is there any outreach for the girl who's involved with it? Any kind of social service for her? Or
I mean, the documents don't specify that, but certainly, I mean, there, just in my experience reporting on one of these cases, one of the first steps is to at least try to connect them with services either through the state or through, through the kind of nonprofit sector. So I would expect that would be the case in this one, but it's not explicitly mentioned in the documents that were made available this week.
And we have to emphasize this is something that the federal government is alleging here, so
Absolutely.
we have to, and so Pascal will have his day in court. Yeah, right, exactly. So do we know when that will, the first court appearance will be?
His arraignment date is set for October 10th, and of course that's a tentative date. And we'll see. I mean, sometimes you see them, plead not guilty, and then immediately just cross over to a section and plead guilty. I'm not entirely sure that would happen in this case, but he will enter a plea. He's scheduled to enter a plea on October 10th.
All right, Ramon. Thanks a lot. Let's go over to Kevin now. And the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeal ruled on the Louisiana abortion law.
Yeah, this is a law that was passed in 2014, signed into law by then Governor Bobby Jindal, and it required that anyone performing an abortion, doctors who perform abortions in Louisiana, would have to have admitting privileges at a hospital within 30 miles of the site where the procedure is done. Now, on the people who supported the law said it's basically a medical and safety and health measure, enhances the ability of the doctor in the case of an emergency or a complication to get the patient into a hospital. Opponents of the law point to stats that would indicate that it doesn't really have a great deal of benefit for patients, and they see it as a ruse to try and make it more difficult, perhaps even impossible, for doctors to perform abortions in some parts of the state. Similar laws have passed in other states, most notably Texas, and the U.S. Supreme Court has struck down the Texas law. In that case, they found that more than 30 of some 40 some odd abortion clinics were closed as a result of the law and difficulties for the doctors in getting admitting privileges, and that it did pose a substantial obstacle to women exercising their right to get an abortion under the current constitutional precedent. In Louisiana, the Fifth Circuit heard arguments a few months ago, and this week the three-judge panel ruled, it was a 2-to-1 ruling, that in Louisiana the circumstances are different. A more compact geography. There are 3 clinics here as opposed to 40 in Texas. Closer proximity for anyone in the state. They also cited differences in the requirements needed to get admitting privileges. There was one dissent, and that would pretty much indicate that certainly the clinics and the doctors who want the right to perform abortions will ask for a rehearing. So few things we should be looking at. Look for them to be asking for a rehearing before the full court. Again, it was a 2-1 decision. All 3 of the judges were appointed by Republican presidents. So, as sometimes happens, it's not who appointed them or who nominated them is not always an indication of how they're going to rule. If this ruling stands, and then it might go to the Supreme Court. Then it's a question, what will that Supreme Court look like? Will Brett Kavanaugh be on that Supreme Court? Brett Kavanaugh has supposedly told Susan Collins of Maine that he sees Roe versus Wade as established law. But would that really mean that he would not overturn it were he there? How would he look at this law if Roe versus Wade were sustained? If Roe versus Wade isn't sustained, Louisiana is one of the states where all of this would be moot because Louisiana's already got a mechanism in place to begin enforcing anti-abortion laws.
Mm-hmm. But for right now, as it stands, with the Fifth Circuit allowing the law they upheld the law. They said that it can stand here in Louisiana, but it's not being implemented at this point. Is that right? Is there a stay on it?
I have not talked to the health department to see how they're going to or enforce it. And the big question, and that's the other thing we have to look for, the opponents of the law say that it could, at some point, throw up obstacles to 70% of the women who might seek abortions in Louisiana in the future. The supporters of the law say it's nowhere near that. The majority in the Fifth Circuit opinion, which reversed a lower court ruling that was made in accordance with the Texas law, the majority in the Fifth Circuit hearing said there's no evidence they would have that kind of an effect. They say it might affect, it appears to them that it would affect only one doctor at one clinic. So that's another thing to be looking for in the coming weeks and months.
Okay. All right, Kevin, thanks a lot. I'm going to go over to Michael now. And you really, a few months ago, how many months? About 6 months, 7 months ago?
6 months, yeah.
Yeah, broke the story about what's called astroturfing with...
That's correct.
With actors actually hired for public hearings. In this case, it was an Entergy hearing regarding their natural gas plant?
New gas plant in New Orleans East.
So that group, hired by a PR agency. It's called Crowds for Demand. Not the PR agency, it was Hawthorne.
Yeah, Hawthorne was hired by Entergy, then Hawthorne hired Crowds on Demand as a subcontractor.
And all of that has led to an investigation called by the council. We'll get into that in a second. First, there is a story regarding this Crowds on Demand group, which involves 2 European billionaires and lawsuits flying. So brief us on that.
Yeah, so the long and short of it is that Crowds on Demand is getting sued in federal court, in district court in South Carolina. And like you said, it's a pretty convoluted story involving Eastern European populism and coal miners in the Czech Republic. But basically what the suit alleges is that Crowds on Demand participated in a conspiracy to extort millions of dollars from a Czech billionaire named Zdeněk Bakala. And basically this, I guess you could call him a rival billionaire from the Slovakian billionaire. He has been waging this campaign in Europe to try and slander his name, to try and get governments to investigate his business dealings. And what the suit alleges is that Krupa, the Slovakian billionaire, approached Bakala and said, I will bring this campaign to U.S., where a lot of your business interests lie, unless you pay me $23 million. Bakala didn't pay him, so Krupa goes to Crowds on Demand. And so Crowds on Demand sets up protests in Omaha and South Carolina and New York, with outside of his home, outside of businesses that he does dealings with, basically demanding that everyone cut ties with them. So Crowds on Demand is in a little bit of trouble here. The reason we actually covered it is because when the suit was sent to us, it had a video on it that said, you might recognize this man. And it's actually the same recruiter that recruited actors in New Orleans. He was leading a protest in Omaha. So, yeah, I mean, it's a strange story, but I think, Adam Swart, the CEO of Crowds on Demand, might be a little over his head on this one.
And the suit is here in the United States.
Correct.
Right? Okay.
Correct.
All right, so let's take a look back then, a little bit closer to home, in
Sure.
our own city council chambers and what happened in that protest. If you can quickly background everybody if they had maybe forgotten or didn't hear about it, and what is the status now of this investigation?
Sure, yeah, so Entergy had applied to build a new power plant in New Orleans East, $211 million, and there had been a lot of debate on that, before this scandal broke out. But what the Lens had found is that
as we talked about before, they hired a subcontractor, Hawthorne, who then hired Crowds on Demand to pay people to speak and make pre-written speeches at the city council meetings. So by the time we broke that, city council had already voted to approve the application for the power plant. Opposition groups had called for them to rescind that decision and have a rehearing, which city council has not done. What they did do was hire independent investigators to look into Entergy's involvement in the scheme. Entergy has maintained that they didn't know that actors were going to be paid. But if you remember, Entergy, City Council also demanded that Entergy hand over thousands of pages of documents, anything related to this scheme, which showed that high up people in Entergy knew a little bit more than they were letting on. So that investigation was supposed to be 30 days. I think about a month ago, City Council extended the deadline 45 days. It is now October 19th. And the reason they extended it is that the independent investigator got another huge cache of documents. It was estimated at 1,500 pages. So there's a lot out there that we haven't seen. We don't know exactly what this contains.
And Entergy still maintains that they did not know that these were actors, that
That's-
actors were being hired
that's
by this PR
correct.
firm that Entergy hired. right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, everyone kind of passes it down. Entergy says they didn't know Hawthorne was going to pay Crowds on Demand. Hawthorne said we didn't know Crowds on Demand paid people. The CEO of Crowds on Demand said he didn't approve of
Right.
the tactics of his recruiters. So the buck has been kind of passed over and over.
And
but
meanwhile, the power plant itself is still on track, correct?
That's correct.
It hasn't really affected anything with the power plant itself.
That's correct. I don't think there's a lot of motivation on City Council to rescind that decision. I think most of them maintain that the decision was based off of a lot of other facts besides these paid actors.
The crowds. And so who's
In fact,
leading
had
this
they done nothing at
investigation?
all, it would have probably still passed.
That's what they've maintained. Jason Williams, Councilmember Jason Williams in particular, who was chair of the Utility Committee during that hearing.
And who's leading the investigation?
So
The
yeah,
independents is-
so it's former Judge Calvin Johnson
from the Criminal District Court.
and Matt Coman, who was the prosecutor in the Ray Nagin case. So
okay.
these are serious guys. So if the deadline stays and we get this information on October 19th, I mean, we should expect a really thorough investigation and get some answers.
Okay. All right, Michael, thanks a lot.
Sure.
Ramon, back over to you. Just a real quick clergy follow. We had you on last week regarding the Jesuit High School case, and then a couple of other cases that were not related to Jesuit, but other cases within the diocese. One question was the Archdiocese going to release names of, credible claims against individuals, credible accusations? Is there anything up to date on that?
Yes, the Archbishop Gregory Aymond, after a couple of our stories ran, was able to give us a few minutes just to ask him some questions, and really tried to kind of see if they could commit to a timeline on when we might see such a release, and still just not. We're open to it. It won't be anytime soon. And then I really was trying to see if we were really interested in seeing if he would elaborate on why it would be so complicated to do a release like we've seen in other states. And the one that he really spent time on, the issue of disclosing credible allegations against clergy members who are dead. Cite and really just kind of relying on a due process argument that the due process, you have accuser, victim,
Right.
and then defendant or the accused, and how the conversation really needs to involve both parties for it to and that if a dead person is no longer around to explain themselves, that's what would give them pause. I don't think that argument is going to resonate very strongly with some of these some of the advocacy groups that represent abuse victims.
Did he indicate any sort of timeline of when they would make a decision as to whether or not names would be released, or no?
No,
They're just thinking about it right now.
Right, and it, very open to it, leaning toward it. Maybe short of a promise of it,
Yeah.
but yeah, no, there's no indication whether, and as I understand it, it won't be soon.
Okay. All right, Ramon, thanks a lot. Let's go over to Errol now, and now a pleasant story. Disney, as you put it,
Yeah.
cruises into town.
Yeah,
When?
happy news. Well, New Orleans has had a pretty active cruise ship scene for the last few years. Most of it has been Carnival. And of the Carnival cruise, most of that has been one ship in particular, a ship called the Carnival Dream, which for the most part comes in on Sundays and comes back on Sundays and just does the so-called Western Caribbean. It's a big ship. It has like 3,600 passengers and 1,300 crew members. And so at one time it was the largest cruise ship. What happens in the cruise thing is that when someone builds their largest cruise ship, somebody says, "Oh yeah, where do you see what I got?"
Right.
And they keep on outdoing each other. But every so often other lines come in. Norwegian comes in from time to time, Royal Caribbean, and a cruise line that's never been here is Disney. And so they announced this week that they're going to come here in 2020, and they have a package of 6 cruises, and as they say, they're testing the waters to see what the market is like. I suspect it's not great news for Carnival, but anyway, but they're going to be doing, for the most part, that this whole expression, Western Caribbean, is something that the cruise lines invented. I mean, it used to be when you talked about the Caribbeans, you were talking about the Antilles and all the area between Miami and Aruba, but now this is the whole Mexican Caribbean. And so they're going to be doing mostly that on 4, 6, and 8 night cruises. They're going to do one cruise going in the opposite direction to the Bahamas, and they're going to do another one, which I think sounds pretty cool, a 14 night cruise through the Panama Canal.
Yeah, that is.
Around. And so it's going to be a pretty exciting package in 2020. And so to have them is pretty prestigious. I got to tell you, last Saturday, I was flying to Denver, and in our flight, just sitting around us were 4 people who had just come back from a cruise, and they were from Salt Lake City, and they went all the way back. And it made me think, okay, if on these cruise ships, and by the way, the new Disney ship, which will be called the Wonder, has 2,400 passengers, which is a lot smaller compared to the Dream, but still big. You know, if half of them, and it's probably way more than that, are flying in and out of New Orleans, this is so good for us. This is why we're able to get more non-stops than ever if we're going somewhere. This is why it makes sense to build a new airport extension, because these cruises are bringing a lot of people in and out. And then also the days they arrive and the days they depart, that they're bringing a lot of people in the streets of New Orleans. If you go to Riverwalk on a Sunday afternoon, and you see these people that are waiting to get in, and so it's a part of the economy that you really don't see. And what you really don't see, which is really major, that cruising out of New Orleans is happening, is on the other side, on the Mexican side, and the whole Yucatan towns like Progreso and Cozumel and Cancun. They're getting a lot of activity, and some of it comes from Galveston too. But New Orleans is feeding just a lot of commerce over there, back and forth.
Right, and supposedly in 2017 there were well over 1 million people that came in for cruises, and about 70% of those are from out of state, and a lot of them stay over in town. You know, they'll book a few extra days here.
Because New Orleans is one destination that people, of all the places they can leave for a cruise from, New Orleans is one place they like to come to just because of the extra advantage of staying over. They might not feel the same way, but that was the problem that Mobile had. When Mobile tried to get some cruise ships, I think it still got a few, but not much activity. It didn't have that same sort of appeal in terms of drawing. People preferred to come to New Orleans, which is a plus that we have.
So the Disney Wonder in 2020, in the spring of 2020, around Mardi Gras time or something?
And the other thing to mention is that, we also have a regrowth of the riverboat cruises. It's not quite what it used to be now, but the combination, right now we're talking about the ocean cruises, but the combination of the ocean cruises, and if the riverboat cruise industry comes back, that could be pretty strong.
Okay, thanks a lot. Over to Kevin again, and you talking about what we believe to be President Lincoln's opera glasses, what he used the last night of his life.
Yeah, the story goes that these were found on the street. They dropped from President Lincoln's mortally wounded body as he was being moved out of Ford's Theater that night. A military officer, a member of what was then called the Washington City Guard, picked them up, put them in his pocket, realized he had them later. There's no indication. The lore does not include a story of whether he tried to get them back to the family in the turmoil that followed the president's assassination, but they were passed down within his family for a few generations. One of the great great-grandsons, I believe, of Captain McCamley was the man's name, was seeking to verify the family stories and the authenticity, and in 1968 they were matched to a case, apparently a perfect match for a case that was found in the box the night that Lincoln was assassinated. And they've changed hands over the years. Malcolm Forbes paid, according to old news archives, something like $24,000 for them. The owners have not always been publicly known, but a couple of weeks ago, the owner of MS Rao Antiques in the Quarter says he got a phone call from the current owner, or what was then the current owner. Didn't tell us the selling price, but he said he had them. They checked out. We've seen background on Christie's and Sotheby's auction sites in the past for them. They are black enameled small binoculars, commonly called excuse me, opera glasses, and they are now at Rao Galleries. Bill Rao tells me that the asking price is going to be $795,000. He's hoping that they end up in a museum.
It's not an auction, it's a sale.
It's not an auction, it's a sale. They are not an auction house, they are a gallery. And he's hoping, although this is, it's a business, then they'll take whoever has the asking price. But they are hoping and promoting them to museums or collections where they would be on a broad public display. And there've been some skepticism expressed over the years about them, but experts seem to think that they are authentic. So.
And the market has been sort of demonstrating that too, because they certainly have sold in the
They've
past for a
yeah.
pretty penny. And I noted in the piece that you wrote about it, they point to a dent or some sort of scratch on a lens.
Bill Rao was
something.
showing, again, the story is that they were dropped by, they fell from Lincoln's clothing or maybe his hands as he was being moved in there. And Bill points to a little nick or a dent on one of the eyepieces. Also, in looking at the old Christie's auction house information on them, they say there's a scratch on a lens that is consistent with them having been dropped. So that adds to the stories of authenticity for them.
So if you're interested
People
in
go to
looking
Rao
into
and
it,
see 'em?
I don't know exactly how much access there is. I was taken up to a second floor area where they're in a display dome, and but I
and once
have
again
to
at
contact
MS
the
Rao,
gallery.
we have to wrap it up at MS Rao on Royal Street, right?
Exactly.
Okay, time to look ahead. E?
Well, today there was a press conference which was the new captain of Rex and the current president of Zulu, and they sat side by side. They each gave $5,000 to area schools.
Very nice. Kevin.
And coming up, be on the lookout as we get closer to Election Day. In addition to congressional races, there are constitutional amendments, and various religious groups crossing denominations and political stripes are starting to work harder to pass the constitutional amendment to make sure there are unanimous jury verdicts in Louisiana cases.
That is a big issue, and Election Day coming up closer. All right, thanks. Michael.
Next week, City Planning Commission is meeting to discuss and vote on its recommendations for changes or potential changes to short-term rental regulations. So that should be a pretty animated meeting.
Yeah, I would think so.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Michael. Ramon.
Man was charged with breaking into the home of an NOPD homicide sergeant who then defended himself. The man was charged with home invasion, but the homicide detective is still facing a battery charge in municipal court from that incident. We'll have a story this weekend's paper on it. It's already online at theadvocate.com.
Right.
Just looking forward to see if the municipal charge will be dismissed at some point.
Okay, all right, Ramon. Thanks a lot, guys, for being here. Thank you all for joining us. And, of course, we want to see you again next week for Informed Sources. Have a good evening.